Problem just got worse ahead of the Friday release. Dan Bongino is out as deputy FBI director, where the situation with Venezuela is now even more primed to go off, and what the actual hell was that manic, desperate speech last?
Okay, so the White House is in absolute crisis mode right now, and what just surfaced in the latest batch of Epstein files is nothing short of devastating for Trump's presidency. We're talking about Dataset 8, a massive dump of previously sealed court documents, depositions, and testimonies that just became public. And buried in hundreds of pages of legal material, there are multiple references to Donald Trump that paint a picture completely at odds with everything he's been saying publicly for years. This isn't some random accusation from a political opponent or some anonymous source whispering to reporters. These are sworn testimonies, court filings, contemporaneous records from the time period when Jeffrey Epstein was operating his network of abuse and manipulation. And what's in these documents is brutal. We're talking about detailed accounts of interactions, parties, private gatherings, phone records, flight logs that go way beyond what was previously known, and most importantly, testimony from multiple witnesses who placed Trump in situations that he has repeatedly and emphatically denied being part of. The White House press operation is in full meltdown mode trying to contain this. Republicans on Capitol Hill are suddenly finding reasons not to comment, and Democrats are already drafting subpoenas and calling for investigations. This is the kind of scandal that doesn't just dominate a news cycle. It fundamentally reshapes how people view a presidency. And it's happening right now, in real time, as Trump is trying to navigate an already chaotic second term. Now, before we dive deeper into what's actually in these files and why this is such a massive problem for Trump, I need to address something important. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore to give you the full picture on stories like this. They either go too soft because they're worried about access, or they sensationalize without giving you the context you need to understand what's actually happening. That's exactly why we built US Power Alert, to bring you real stories, real context, and absolutely no corporate spin. We're here every single day breaking down the political developments that actually matter, the ones that affect real power, real institutions, and your real life. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and understand what's really going on behind closed doors in Washington, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. Just hit that subscribe button below. We're building a community of people who care about truth, who want the full story, not the sanitized version, not the version that's been focus grouped and approved by some media conglomerate's legal team. This is your moment to be part of something that actually holds power accountable. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us. All right? Let's get back to the video.
We're adding.
We fully expect Trump, Bondi, and their minions to dodge, delay, or partially release these files. We are all asking the obvious question that looms. President Trump, what are you trying to hide?
With that, then bringing us to our main story here, and that is a bombshell update on what I'd like to call the curious misadventures of Don and Jeff. Because the New York Times just published a wild investigation into their past relationship based on never-before-seen documents and interviews with 30 people from that time, many of whom have never spoken publicly before.
Here's what happened. Late last week, a federal judge in the Southern District of New York ordered the release of what's being called Dataset 8 of the Epstein files. This is part of an ongoing legal effort by journalists, victims advocates, and transparency groups to unseal documents related to the various civil lawsuits that were filed against Jeffrey Epstein's estate and his associates after his death. For years, many of these documents have been kept under seal, either because they involved minors, because they were part of settlement agreements, or because powerful people fought to keep them hidden. But judges have been slowly ordering their release, piece by piece, as the public interest in transparency has outweighed the privacy concerns of the individuals named in them. Dataset 8 is one of the largest batches released so far, containing over 600 pages of depositions, witness statements, email correspondence, phone records, and financial documents that paint a detailed picture of Epstein's social circle and operations between the mid-1990s and the early 2000s. And Donald Trump's name appears throughout these documents in ways that are deeply problematic. We're talking about testimony from multiple witnesses, including some of Epstein's former employees, household staff, pilots, and individuals who attended gatherings at Epstein's various properties in Manhattan, Palm Beach, and the private island in the Caribbean. Several of these witnesses describe seeing Trump at Epstein's Manhattan townhouse on multiple occasions, not just at large social events, but at smaller, more private gatherings. One deposition from a former employee describes Trump arriving late in the evening, being escorted to a private area of the residence, and staying for hours. Another witness describes phone calls between Trump and Epstein that happened with surprising frequency during a specific period in the late 1990s, with records showing dozens of calls over just a few months. There are descriptions of Trump attending parties where young women, described by witnesses as appearing to be in their late teens or very early 20s, were present in large numbers, often outnumbering the men in attendance by significant margins. And here's where it gets particularly damaging. Multiple witnesses described Trump engaging in behavior that they found uncomfortable or inappropriate, making comments about women's appearances, making physical contact that seemed overly familiar, and participating in conversations that were explicitly sexual in nature in the presence of these young women. Now, to be absolutely clear, nothing in Dataset 8 directly accuses Trump of illegal activity. There is no testimony alleging that Trump participated in the abuse of minors. There is no evidence presented that he knew about Epstein's criminal behavior at the time, and there are no criminal charges being filed as a result of these documents. But what these files do is completely undermine the narrative that Trump and his team have been pushing for years, which is that Trump barely knew Epstein, that they were casual acquaintances who occasionally crossed paths at social events in New York and Florida, and that Trump had no real relationship with him. Trump has repeatedly said publicly that he wasn't a fan of Epstein, that he had a falling out with him years ago, and that he was never part of Epstein's inner circle. These documents suggest something very different. They suggest a relationship that was closer, more frequent, and more involved than Trump has ever admitted. And in politics, that kind of discrepancy between what you've said publicly and what the documented record shows is absolutely devastating. The White House response has been predictably defensive and chaotic. Within hours of the documents being released, the press office put out a statement calling the coverage a political hit job, claiming that the documents are being taken out of context, and arguing that Trump has been completely transparent about his past association with Epstein. But that statement immediately ran into problems because reporters started pulling up Trump's own words from previous interviews, where he praised Epstein, where he joked about Epstein liking women on the younger side, and where he described Epstein as a terrific guy. The White House then tried to argue that those comments were made decades ago, before anyone knew about Epstein's crimes, and that Trump has since condemned Epstein in the strongest possible terms. But that defense falls apart when you look at the timeline, because some of the incidents described in Dataset 8 occurred after there were already whispers and rumors in elite circles about Epstein's behavior with young women. Legal experts and investigative journalists have pointed out that by the late 1990s, it was something of an open secret among certain social circles in Manhattan and Palm Beach that Epstein had an unsettling interest in very young women, and that his parties had a particular atmosphere. The idea that Trump, who moved in those exact same circles and who by multiple accounts had a fairly close relationship with Epstein during that period, was completely unaware of any of this, is becoming harder and harder to believe. And this is where things start to unravel for the White House in a much bigger way, because this isn't just about Trump's past relationship with a now deceased sex offender. This is about credibility, this is about honesty, and this is about what it means when a sitting president has spent years telling the American public one version of events and then documents surface that tell a very different story. Republicans on Capitol Hill are already starting to feel the heat. Several GOP senators who are up for re-election in 2026 have been asked by reporters whether they believe Trump has been truthful about his relationship with Epstein, and their answers have been carefully worded non-answers. They talk about how Epstein was a monster, they talk about how justice needs to be served for his victims, but they conspicuously avoid defending Trump's version of events. That's a tell. When your own party members won't go on record defending you, it means they've seen the documents, they've talked to their own legal advisors, and they've concluded that this is not a fight they want to be in. Democrats, meanwhile, are already calling for congressional hearings. Multiple House committees have announced that they're reviewing the documents to determine whether there are grounds for subpoenas, for bringing in witnesses who are named in the files, and for demanding that Trump himself testify under oath about his relationship with Epstein and what he knew about Epstein's activities. Let's talk about the legal and institutional context here, because this is important for understanding why this matters so much. The release of these documents is happening because of a long legal battle over transparency in the Epstein case. After Epstein's arrest in 2019 and his subsequent death in federal custody, there was a massive public outcry about how he had been allowed to operate for so long, about the sweetheart plea deal he received in Florida back in 2008, and about how many powerful people in his orbit seemed to escape any accountability. Victims and their advocates filed motions to unseal documents from the various civil cases that had been filed against Epstein over the years, arguing that the public had a right to know the full scope of his network and how he was able to evade justice for so long. Initially, judges were reluctant to release many of these documents because they contained sensitive information about victims, because they named individuals who had not been charged with any crimes, and because there were concerns about privacy and reputational harm. But over time, as more information came to light about just how extensive Epstein's network was and how many powerful people were involved, judges started siding with transparency. The release of Dataset 8 is part of that ongoing process. The judge who ordered the release wrote in her decision that while the individuals named in these documents have a legitimate interest in privacy, that interest is outweighed by the overwhelming public interest in understanding how Epstein operated, who enabled him, and who benefited from their association with him. She specifically noted that several of the individuals named in the documents, including Trump, have made public statements about their relationship with Epstein that appear to be contradicted by the evidence in the court record, and that the public has a right to evaluate those discrepancies for themselves. That's a really significant legal finding because it essentially says that when you're a public figure and you make claims about your past, you don't get to hide behind privacy protections if documents exist that call those claims into question. And for Trump, who is not just a public figure, but the sitting president of the United States, that standard is even higher. The American people have a right to know whether their president has been truthful about his past associations, especially when those associations involve someone like Jeffrey Epstein. Now here's the problem for Trump. These documents don't exist in a vacuum. This isn't the first time his relationship with Epstein has been questioned, and it's not the first time there have been allegations or suggestions of inappropriate behavior with women. Trump has faced multiple accusations of sexual misconduct over the years. He was caught on tape making extremely vulgar comments about women, and he's been sued in civil court by women alleging assault and harassment. He's denied all of these accusations. He's called his accusers liars, and his political base has largely stood by him, arguing that these are politically motivated attacks. But what Dataset 8 does is provide contemporaneous, documentary evidence that supports a pattern of behavior that Trump's critics have been describing for years. It's one thing to dismiss accusers as partisan or unreliable. It's a lot harder to dismiss court documents, witness depositions, and records that were created at the time the events were happening. And when you combine this new information with everything that's already in the public record, the picture that emerges is deeply troubling. Legal experts are already pointing out that while Dataset 8 doesn't create any immediate legal jeopardy for Trump, it absolutely creates political and reputational jeopardy. Several former prosecutors who worked on sex trafficking and abuse cases have said publicly that the level of detail in some of these depositions, the consistency across multiple witnesses, and the documentary corroboration from phone records and other sources would be more than enough to justify a serious investigation if Trump were not the sitting president. That's a stunning thing to hear from people who understand the legal standards for these kinds of cases. They're essentially saying that if this were anyone else, law enforcement would be taking a very hard look at this. But because Trump is president, because he has executive privilege, and because the Justice Department has a long-standing policy against indicting a sitting president, there's very little that can be done from a criminal perspective right now. However, that doesn't protect him from congressional oversight, it doesn't protect him from civil lawsuits, and it absolutely doesn't protect him from the political fallout. Okay, let's break down what this actually means, because there are multiple layers to this crisis and they're all happening at the same time. First, understand that this is fundamentally a credibility crisis for Trump and for the White House. For years, Trump has maintained a specific narrative about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. He's said repeatedly that they knew each other socially, that they weren't particularly close, and that he distanced himself from Epstein long before anyone knew about the criminal behavior. Dataset 8 calls all of that into question. The volume of contact described in these documents, the nature of the interactions, the settings in which they occurred, all of it suggests a relationship that was significantly closer and more involved than Trump has admitted. And when a president is caught in that kind of discrepancy, it raises fundamental questions about what else he might be lying about, what else he might be hiding, and whether the American people can trust anything he says. That's not a partisan attack. That's a basic question of democratic accountability. If you can't trust the president to tell the truth about his past, how can you trust him to tell the truth about policy, about national security, about anything that affects the country? Second, this is a political disaster heading into the 2026 midterms. Republicans are already facing a difficult electoral map. They're defending seats in swing states and districts where Trump's approval ratings are underwater. And they've been trying to focus the national conversation on issues where they think they have an advantage, things like the economy, immigration, and crime. But now, for the foreseeable future, the national conversation is going to be dominated by these Epstein documents, by questions about Trump's past, and by demands for investigations and accountability. Every Republican candidate is going to be asked whether they believe Trump's version of events, whether they think he should testify, and whether they're comfortable supporting a president who has these kinds of associations in his background. That puts them in an impossible position. If they defend Trump, they risk alienating moderate and independent voters who are horrified by the Epstein case and who don't want to be associated with anyone in that orbit. If they distance themselves from Trump, they risk infuriating the MAGA base, losing primary challenges and tanking their fundraising. There's no good option here, and Democrats know it. They're going to make sure that every Republican candidate has to answer for this, in every debate, in every town hall, in every campaign ad. Third, this has massive implications for Trump's ability to govern and to maintain support within his own party. Trump's political power has always been based on a combination of his hold over the Republican base and his ability to project strength and dominance. The base loves him because he fights, because he doesn't apologize, because he tells the establishment to go to hell. But that image depends on him being seen as a winner, as someone who's always in control, as someone who can't be taken down by his enemies. Dataset 8 threatens that image because it shows him in a position of weakness. It shows him being caught in a lie. It shows him having to defend himself against allegations that he can't simply dismiss or bully his way out of. And if the base starts to sense that Trump is damaged goods, that he's a liability rather than an asset, his entire political operation could start to crumble. We've already seen cracks forming, with some conservative media figures and Republican operatives quietly suggesting that the party needs to start thinking about a post-Trump future. If these documents continue to generate bad headlines, and if more damaging information comes out in future releases, those quiet suggestions could turn into a full-blown movement to push Trump aside. Fourth, this creates an opening for prosecutors and investigators who have been looking for ways to hold Trump accountable for various alleged misconduct. Remember, Trump is already facing multiple legal challenges, both criminal and civil. He's dealing with federal charges related to classified documents. He's dealing with state charges in Georgia related to election interference. He's dealing with civil lawsuits related to his business practices. And he's dealing with ongoing investigations into his actions on January 6th. What Dataset 8 does is provide additional ammunition for prosecutors and plaintiffs who are trying to establish a pattern of behavior, who are trying to show that Trump has a history of dishonesty, that he has a history of inappropriate conduct with women, and that he has a history of surrounding himself with people who operate outside the bounds of acceptable behavior. In legal terms, this is called propensity evidence or character evidence. And while it's not always admissible in criminal trials, it can be extremely powerful in civil cases and in the court of public opinion. Several of the women who have sued Trump in the past have already indicated that they plan to file motions to introduce the Epstein documents as evidence in their cases, arguing that it supports their claims that Trump has a pattern of predatory behavior toward women. Fifth, this has serious implications for America's credibility on the world stage, particularly when it comes to issues of human rights, human trafficking, and the rule of law. The United States has long positioned itself as a global leader in the fight against sex trafficking and exploitation. The State Department publishes an annual trafficking in persons report that grades countries around the world on their efforts to combat trafficking, and the U.S. has used that report to pressure other nations to improve their laws and enforcement. But how does that work when the American president is credibly alleged to have been closely associated with one of the most notorious sex offenders in modern history? How does the U.S. maintain moral authority on these issues when the documents show that Trump was attending parties and gatherings where young women were present in circumstances that multiple witnesses found troubling? Foreign leaders and diplomats are already whispering about this in private conversations. America's allies are deeply uncomfortable with the idea that they have to stand next to Trump at international summits and defend the US-led international order when there are these kinds of allegations swirling around him. And America's adversaries are absolutely going to use this as propaganda, as a way to argue that the US is hypocritical, that American leaders are corrupt, and that the US has no right to lecture other countries about human rights. Sixth, this is going to have a profound impact on the broader cultural and social conversation about accountability for powerful men. The Epstein case has become symbolic of a larger problem, which is that wealthy and powerful men have been able to abuse, exploit, and mistreat women for decades with very little consequence. The Me Too movement and other efforts to demand accountability have made some progress, but there's still a widespread sense that the most powerful people, the ones at the very top of society, remain untouchable. Trump being forced to answer for his relationship with Epstein, and for the discrepancies between his public statements and the documentary record, could be a significant moment in that larger struggle. If Trump can be held accountable, if he can't just lie his way out of this or use his power to make it go away, it sends a message that no one is above scrutiny, no one is above the law, and no one gets a free pass just because they're wealthy or politically powerful. But if Trump skates on this, if he's able to survive this scandal the way he's survived so many others, it sends the opposite message. It tells victims that even when there's documentary evidence, even when there are multiple witnesses, even when the facts are on your side, power still wins. That's a deeply demoralizing message for everyone who's been fighting for accountability and justice. And here's what you need to watch for in the coming weeks and months. First, watch for additional releases from the Epstein files. Dataset 8 is not the last batch of documents that's going to be unsealed. Judges have indicated that there are more tranches coming, and there's no telling what else might be in there. Every time a new batch drops, there's a risk that more damaging information about Trump or other powerful figures will come to light. Second, watch for congressional action. Democrats are going to push hard for hearings, for subpoenas, for document requests, and for testimony from witnesses named in the files. They're going to try to keep this story alive all the way through 2025 and into the 2026 campaign season. Republicans are going to resist, but if the public pressure gets intense enough, some Republicans might break ranks and support calls for investigation. Third, watch for legal developments. Several of the witnesses mentioned in Dataset 8 have indicated that they're willing to cooperate with investigators or to provide additional testimony if asked. If prosecutors decide to open new investigations based on this information, we could see subpoenas, grand juries, and potentially new charges down the line. Fourth, watch for Trump's response. So far, he's been defensive and dismissive. But if the pressure continues to build, he might try a different strategy. He might try to preemptively release information to get ahead of the story. He might try to attack the witnesses and the documents as unreliable. Or he might try to change the subject by creating some other controversy. Whatever he does, it's going to tell us a lot about how seriously he thinks this threatens his presidency. And fifth, watch the polls. If Trump's approval ratings start to drop significantly, if he starts losing support among independents and even among some Republicans, that's a sign that this scandal is breaking through in a way that previous scandals haven't. So here's the bottom line. Dataset 8 of the Epstein files is an absolute nightmare for Donald Trump and for the White House. These documents provide detailed, contemporaneous, documentary evidence of a relationship between Trump and Jeffrey Epstein that was far closer and far more extensive than Trump has ever publicly admitted. The documents include witness testimony that places Trump at Epstein's properties on multiple occasions, that describes troubling behavior involving young women, and that directly contradicts the narrative Trump has been selling to the American people for years. This isn't a political attack. This isn't anonymous sources. This isn't speculation. These are court documents, sworn depositions, records that were created at the time these events were happening. And the implications are massive. Politically, this is a disaster for Republicans heading into 2026. It's a disaster for Trump's ability to maintain credibility and authority. And it's a potential disaster for his legal situation as prosecutors and plaintiffs look for ways to use this information in ongoing cases. Institutionally, this is a crisis of accountability and transparency. It's a test of whether powerful people can be held to the same standards as everyone else. And it's a moment where the American people are going to have to decide what they're willing to tolerate from their leaders. Internationally, this is a humiliation for the United States. It undermines America's moral authority on human rights issues, and it gives adversaries a propaganda gift that they're going to exploit for years. And culturally, this is a pivotal moment in the broader fight for accountability for powerful men who have abused and exploited women. This story is far from over. More documents are coming, more witnesses are going to speak, and the pressure on Trump and the White House is only going to intensify. The question is whether the institutions designed to provide accountability, Congress, the courts, the media, and ultimately the voters, are going to do their job. Are they going to demand answers? Are they going to insist on transparency? And are they going to hold Trump accountable for the discrepancies between what he said and what the documented record shows? Or is this going to be another scandal that Trump somehow survives? Another moment where power and political calculation triumph over truth and justice? We're about to find out. And the answer is going to tell us a lot about the state of American democracy and about what kind of country we want to be. Keep your eyes on this, because what happens next could define not just Trump's presidency, but the next decade of American politics and American society. This is a reckoning that's been a long time coming, and it's happening right now, in real time, and the stakes could not be higher.